Hi, I'm Kate from House of Design, and I wanted to share with you a project today using terracotta pots. And Miss Rose is going to be our videographer today. And
I'll try not to be too much of a peanut gallery.
thank you so much. But she always asks good questions that kind of pick up a point I might have missed, so we appreciate that. So the tools you're going to need today are going to be a pair of wire cutters for cutting your artificial materials with. A little pair of bolt cutters is wonderful to have because they go through the thick stems a little bit easier. You'll need a knife. A paring knife from the kitchen will work just fine. It's for cutting the foam. And then just a couple of florist wires. They're green enameled. About a 22 gauge works. You're going to want to bend them in half like so to make little short legs on them, and then cut them with your wire cutter. So you now have what we call fern pins. And this will be for attaching your moss.
Now, is this something people can find online if they don't happen to have the florist wire? Or
I haven't looked online, but I know that the hobby stores like Michael's has it, and I have seen it at Walmart as well, which we have available here.
Okay.
So you're going to need a block of dry base foam, or at least a partial block so you can make small pieces, some preserved moss. It's been dyed so it stays nice and green, an artificial ivy, whatever your favorite artificial bush is in the blooming department, and then a selection of terracotta pots. I'm using a glue gun. You could use a glue pan as well. We are doing artificial, but this would translate easily into fresh. You would just use soil instead of moss, in which case you're going to want to go to a little bit different type of glue for that, because your pan glue or hot melt glue will let go once if the terracotta gets wet with your live plants. So there's many glues on the market that will work for that part. So to begin with, you're going to take a large saucer, and we're going to kind of work our way into smaller and smaller sizes to make what we call an epergne, which is the Victorian term for a stacked type of container. This is definitely a little contemporary because we're working with terracotta. That's definitely not a Victorian item. We'll pull our next size pot, so we're going to go from a saucer to a clay pot, and then a saucer on top. When they're very heavy, if you want to take this apart after the fact, if you don't glue it together, you can easily separate it. If you want it to stay very well, you're going to want to put some hot glue. It really doesn't matter if it kind of over glues the edges, because it's all going to be covered up. So we're going to put that on, and then put this in the dead center of that saucer.
And just be careful, because Kate's good with glue, but those of us that are a little bit more sensitive, that glue gets hot.
It gets around 400 degrees,
Okay.
which is why if you're working with pan glue, it melts at around 300. So it's much more forgiving if you get into it. The nice thing with the glue gun in this instance is that it allows us to put the glue right where we want it, instead of in a pan that we have to then sort of dip it on. So we're just gluing these together, stacking them up. If you ever like to do Legos or Lincoln Logs, this is kind of like the perfect
like
design.
adults. You've grown up, and this is, I like that. I love Legos.
Yeah, me too. I don't think you really have to be a child to do Legos. At least I hope.
No, I was actually kind of looking for some online the other day because of all this chilling out at home.
So many cool things with Legos now.
There are.
I'm sure we could build flower containers for them. So I'm just gluing and stacking these together. And then lastly, we'll put this little saucer on top. And our little one, and I'm going to turn this one upright because I want it to be a flower pot, so to speak, and hold a plant in more of an upright position. So now our dry base foam, we can cut little pieces. And you don't want them to be much taller than the height of the saucer. And you can see I've just cut a little slice off there. We can take these pieces like so. And they're going to glue down in a little bit randomly. And if you don't get them right where you want them, you can always just cover them up and put another one somewhere else. So you'll see in a minute what we're going to do with these. And as you get higher up, you can start making pieces that are a little bit smaller. You don't have to be fancy. this is what you'll use to put your materials into. Now, if you were doing this with live plants, of course, you'd want to fill these containers with soil so that they could root into it. Now, taking your preserved moss, you're going to just tear it into little pieces and kind of fill in around the edges of the container. Like
and Katie's trying to do this fast, so you'll, you know, when you do it yourself, it might be a little smoother. I don't know what to say.
It's we always do this for camera, and then I go back to the bench and finish it and make it perfect. And then we'll get a still shot of it for you that you can see at the end of the video.
There we go.
So I'm just tearing bits of this off and filling it in around the rim here in each of the saucers.
The moss is fun because it's really forgiving. It kind of covers up any issues.
All right.
Not that I ever have issues when I'm making an arrangement.
No, never. Nor do I. And lastly, we'll do something around here. And then the pot's going to take a little bit bigger piece of foam because it's deeper. We want it to go all the way down inside the pot so you can kind of test it and see what height it needs to be. And we know about that high. We'll cut that off and put it down inside a little bit so there's room for the moss to go on top of it and not float over the top of the pot. Now, if you wanted this to be super permanent, you'd want to be kind of doing a little bit of gluing of the moss as you stick it into the saucers. But generally speaking, we like to be able to take it apart. It's easier to store, or I'll send it back to the garden shed so you can plant them next year with live plants in them. Now, with your ivy, I've taken a bush, and this one's been a little bit styled out just so you could see the different arms on it. And we're going to cut that with our wire cutters, cut some of the branches off. And then we can take these, and you'll just want to bend them so they kind of go into a circle, which will make them fit around your saucer nicely. And this is where your foam's going to come in that you put in already. You can attach these pieces of ivy into that foam. Now, let's say I was putting this here and I wanted this to go into a foam and there's no foam there. You're simply going to take another small piece, put a little glue on it, and lift your moss and put that underneath. And now you've got that spot where you can attach the ivy. And so if your ivy doesn't want to stay in place, the two keys to controlling it are one, your foam. I'll just put this in the front so you can see easily how that works. Then we can take those fern pins that we made in the beginning, and we're going to just pin that right over the top of that ivy stem so that it holds it in position. And this is where you decide, do you want it to be kind of wild and woolly, or do you want to have it be very structured and symmetrical? And so with that choice, you're either going to let your ivy be a little bit loose, or you're going to keep it very contained in there and very circular to follow the form of your saucers. And you'll do that same pattern all the way up in each one of the saucers, filling them in as much as you want. I tend to be a jungle gardener, and I like stuff wild and crazy and going everywhere. But
A little bit of a secret garden look.
yeah, definitely. But formal is nice too, so doing it where things are more symmetrical and more contained, clipped, like topiaries, is nice too, so you could give it much more of an effect like that.
So if this were real ivy, would you have planted it at the very top terracotta, or how would you have
You'd fill
executed
these
that?
all with soil,
Okay.
and then chicken wire can be your best friend with doing this type of thing, because you can put your soil in, put some moss in there, and then put chicken wire over the top to help everything stay in the containers, because they're very shallow. In our climate, with the heat that we have, doing something with ivy like this, you'd have to water it 3 or 4 times a day probably, because you won't have much of a water source with the soil because it is so shallow. We do these in artificial succulents too, and that would be really good in live plants because they're much more drought tolerant. And
very true. And succulents are fine once they're kind of drooping over the edge too, and there's some wayward ivy on the second deck there.
Oh, we got some wildness going on here. Well, I think I missed the foam on that one apparently. I'll just repin that little guy. Glue's your best friend when doing artificials because nothing will go anywhere when you use it. But in lieu of taking more time with this, we're just kind of shoving this in here.
Stick a hairpin in it and call it good.
And lastly, you can come in with these. If you want it to be a little bit looser, just add some small pieces of ivy in there. And we can do a little bit of height with this. If you're going to do succulents with this, when you put your foam in, you want to completely circle the container, so your entire saucer will have a ring of foam all the way around that you can plant them in, because succulents obviously don't have vines to them, and it makes it such that they have to have a foam in each location that you're going to place them to set down into. All right. I think that we're about there, and then to top this off, we'll go ahead and add our pretty little flowers to it. We thought maybe red poppies for this one. And again, you have to style all of your artificials, so I'm just pulling those out with the wires in and bending them into position. And we can cut the bulk of the stem off so it's not so long. And we'll put this into the top, and this just gets pushed down in the foam. I'm using 2 plants in this one just because of the size of the epergne. We need to have enough of a top on it to balance the visual weight of the rest of the container. In this little one, we did a single poppy.
So this would be pretty, well, especially during the summer, but if someone were doing something for 4th of July, they could just stick an American flag at the top.
There you go.
For their...
Sure.
Okay.
And lastly, maybe a pretty little cute bird in there. We did a bird's nest in this one over here. And then there's these are the mossy pots here, which is what we did this epergne with. We used terracotta and did the mossy paint on it. And if you want to see how to do this finish, we have a video on our website at shophouseofdesign.com. Thank you for helping, Rose, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.